Hi everyone, so in this video we're going to talk about how energy cycles through ecosystems. What we're going to see is that the movement of energy is not a very efficient process. We lose lots of energy as heat when it's being passed from one organism to another. And the major processes that we're going to start by talking about by which energy moves through ecosystems are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So let's start by looking at photosynthesis. Nearly all energy in ecosystems comes from the sun originally. Then producers, they're also called autotrophs, are plants, algae, and some bacteria that use the sun's energy to produce usable forms of energy via photosynthesis. So solar energy is a form of kinetic energy, and it is converted into chemical energy by the process of photosynthesis. So this equation that we have here is unbalanced. If we were to balance it, you would need 6 carbon dioxide, 6 water molecules, plus sunlight is used to form a glucose molecule and 6 molecules of oxygen. But we don't need to look at that for our purposes right now. But basically in photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight are taken in by plants. Plants can then use this energy to recombine the atoms in these molecules to form an organic form of energy or chemical energy, which is glucose. And then the waste product of photosynthesis is oxygen. So while only plants and other producers actually do photosynthesis, both plants and animals and other organisms, other living things, perform cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is also called aerobic respiration, which just means that it has to be done in the presence of oxygen. So oxygen is required to perform cellular respiration. So what this process does is it's basically just photosynthesis in reverse, but living things take these glucose molecules and they break them apart. When they break them apart, that releases a lot of energy, and then that energy can be used to perform necessary things within cells. So some organisms do not do aerobic respiration. They actually do anaerobic respiration, which means it's done without oxygen, or there's a lack of oxygen. Oxygen is not required. So this is done by organisms that live in environments that lack oxygen. These organisms are often bacteria, and it's often done in environments like swamps that don't have much oxygen because the soils are kind of waterlogged. And it doesn't provide as much energy as cellular respiration. So we can still break down glucose molecules if oxygen is not present, but it's not as efficient. We get less energy. So something to know about anaerobic respiration is less energy is actually released or is made available to perform cellular processes. So primary productivity is the rate at which sunlight is converted into organic compounds or sugars. This is our glucose, our C6H12O6, via photosynthesis over time. You can also think of primary productivity as the rate of photosynthesis of all producers in an area. So primary productivity is also the rate of photosynthesis. This is by producers in a given area in a given time. So with that, the units for primary productivity, we have kilocalories per meter squared per year. So this is the energy unit. This is our area. So how much energy is converted into sugars in a given area over a given period of time. So that's kind of the breakdown of the units. Since photosynthesis leads to growth, you can also think of primary productivity as the amount of plant growth in an area over a given period of time. So photosynthesis is used to make these sugar molecules. Sugar molecules form a lot of the structural components of plants. So as these molecules are formed, plants are also able to grow. And then producers that live in ecosystems with warm temperatures, lots of water, and nutrients have the highest rates of productivity. And in general, ecosystems that have high primary productivity are usually more diverse. They can support basically more species when you have more plant growth and more energy available in the ecosystem. So something that we as consumers are very interested in, and by consumers what I mean is we cannot perform photosynthesis. So consumers are also called heterotrophs, and that means we cannot do photosynthesis. So we have to get our sugars and our energy, our cellular or chemical energy from other places. So we are really interested in net primary productivity, and I'll tell you why that is. So gross primary productivity, or GPP, is the total amount of solar energy that producers in an ecosystem capture via photosynthesis over time. So this, again, really important, this is our total amount. Net primary productivity is the amount of energy or biomass, so the amount of plant growth that's occurred that is left over for consumers after plants have used some for their own cellular respiration. So again, producers or plants can do both photosynthesis and respiration, but luckily they do a lot more photosynthesis than respiration. So although they make these molecules of glucose, and they use these molecules of glucose, but they also make a lot of excess. So that excess is the energy that can then support the remaining consumers in that ecosystem. So a way to think about gross and net primary productivity is GPP is kind of similar to the total amount of money that your employer would pay you. So gross or GPP is similar to total money you make at your job. Whereas NPP is like your actual take home. So that's the amount of energy that's actually available after taxes, quote unquote, or the amount of respiration that plants have to do are removed. So NPP is what's left for the consumers. So let's do a quick example. So this equation at the top right here is what we use to calculate net primary productivity. So in this example, in a temperate seasonal forest, GPP can be approximately 13,000 kcals per meter squared per year, and respiration can be 8,000 kcals per meter squared per year. So we're looking to calculate NPP, so luckily our equation's already set up to do that. So we have NPP equals GPP minus R. So in this problem specifically, we are given, this is GPP, and we are given respiration. So NPP equals GPP, which is 13,000 kcals per meter squared per year. So this is the total photosynthesis that's done in this temperate seasonal forest, subtracted by respiration, or subtracting respiration, which is 8,000 kcals per meter squared per year, which is the amount of energy that these plants have to use to perform cellular respiration. So what we're left over with then when you subtract those two numbers is 5,000 kcals per meter squared per year. And when we do math in environmental science, there's not a lot of it on the AP test. There's between 4 and 8 multiple choice questions, and then 1 FRQ is math based. But when you're doing your math, especially in the FRQ portion, you always need to have units. So it's really important that even when you're doing these problems, which are just basic subtraction, it's really important that you're writing your units every time. So that's a tip for the AP test. So the process of photosynthesis is not very efficient. Only about 1% of all the incoming solar energy is actually converted into chemical energy via photosynthesis. So plants are only able to take in 1% of that solar energy and use it to make glucose. Most of that solar energy is lost as heat, and it just kind of dissipates back into the atmosphere. And then some of that solar energy exists in wavelengths that producers cannot absorb. So those wavelengths are either reflected or they just pass through those producers' tissues, but they can't actually use it to help make glucose. Of that 1% of the total energy, about 40% of it is converted into biomass or plant growth. So that means 60% of it, if we look at this diagram right here, 60% is used up by plants to do their own respiration. About 40% is used to actually help those plants grow, and that energy can then be used by consumers in the ecosystem. So that means only about 0.4% of incoming solar energy is actually accessible to consumers. So some ecosystems are more efficient, they'll have a higher NPP than others, and some are very, very inefficient. Aquatic ecosystems, for example, like when we're looking at the open ocean, they are very inefficient because certain wavelengths of light cannot even pass through the water, so producers have no access to them. So for example, if we look at this graph, these wavelengths of red light, once you get past 50 meters, which is this line right here, here's a really sad kelp right here, these producers can't even use this wavelength of light to perform photosynthesis. So in general, they might be able to use all of their wavelengths, all of these wavelengths of visible light. But once you get further and further down into the ocean, less of these pieces of solar radiation are even accessible to those plants. So they're a lot less efficient. They can use less solar energy. So by measuring net primary productivity, we can compare the productivity of different ecosystems. In general, when you have high productivity, you also have high biodiversity. So when we've got lots of energy being converted into sugars, we can support more types of organisms. But productivity is highly dependent on whether that ecosystem has enough sunlight, whether there's enough water, and whether there are enough nutrients. If there's a lack of any of these three things, that area will be less productive. So again, producers grow the best in ecosystems with plenty of sunlight, lots of water and nutrients. In general, those are places like tropical rainforests and salt marshes. So tropical rainforest right here is our most productive terrestrial ecosystem. Swamps and marshes are our most productive aquatic ecosystems. And then producers that grow in cold or dry or dark regions are going to be less productive. So our less productive regions here are our extreme deserts, our scrub, that's the still deserts, and our kind of Arctic regions, our tundra. And then our open ocean is also a region that is much less productive. So in general, the more productivity we have, the more herbivores can be supported, and the more biodiversity we will have in general. So for your practice FRQ, there's 3 parts to it. The last one is a simple calculation. So again, remember to use this formula, NPP equals GPP minus R. And hint, you might have to rearrange that formula a little bit in order to solve for respiration for this problem, because right now we're asking you to solve for respiration.